Aphoristic Appendage to On Truthtelling. 351 to 400. 351. There are some books that are talked about more than they are read. Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf is one of them, James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake is another. Now suppose these books were anonymously published. Would they have attracted so much attention? Would scholars have spent countless hours poring over them? Would the one be considered an important historical moment and the other a literary masterpiece? Or, if no connection could be drawn between them and the authors, would the first be considered an autobiographical monstrosity and the second a literary one? In short, can marketing take many different forms and, as one of them, delineate a powerful or illustrious context that makes all the difference between valuing and not valuing a work? 352. Everyone is stalked by death, but when you get old, you feel it breathing down your neck. 353. It may do well to keep in mind that many contemporary issues would easily be erased by earth-shaking events. 354. When one country starts talking about the atrocities committed by some other country to which it is hostile, it's often the first step towards justifying the same. 355. As truth-telling, an argument is an aphorism that moves outside its comfort zone and into, one might say, a combat zone. 356. The ego is an exceptional awareness unashamedly exaggerating itself. 357. Distractions. Distractions. When aren't they needed, be they innocuous or otherwise, to lighten the daily load or spice up the all-too-familiar? Only childhood, youthful exuberance, love, and drunkenness seem to nullify this need, periods of our lives or states of mind so caught up in one big distraction that no others are required. 358. It's part of our culture to prop up the dying, to keep them going as long as possible. But at what cost to the happiness, well-being, and perhaps even the dignity and sincerity of all concerned? I'm referring to what we often have to say to each other at such times that's not particularly true to our feelings. What's the alternative? A culture in which someone dies with almost everyone in a festive mood. As if the stricken person were going off for a miraculous cure. As if it were such a happy moment that invitations should be sent out. Oh, I know it sounds crazy. Death and dying aren't really beautiful. Despite all the efforts to plaster or paint over the ugliness, we're still left with the corpse or something on its way to being one. This is brutal, insensitive talk. Besides, it contradicts what you were saying about making the dying process attractive. I said things the way I did so as not to pretend that revulsion isn't at the heart of at least some of our reactions to death and dying. As for the rest, it would take a complete overhaul of our collective imagination to make this process attractive and, possibly with humor, revulsion-free. 359. Yes, anyone can get whacked, but, at least when you're young, you don't have this as one of your daily thoughts unless you're in a combat zone. 360. Absolute transparency would dictate admitting that most of our daily whimsical, non-practical thoughts are, apart from the few real insights and good ideas we have, repetitive rubbish. 361. Most people don't stop to think that opinions are based not only on knowledge but on lack of knowledge, and that, if one had complete knowledge, which is of course impossible, one would have no opinions. 362. What we call memory is only the conscious part of something vastly greater that's thousands if not millions of years old. 363. Anyone who harshly judges the past on the basis of the values of the present shows signs of something they obviously don't consider to be a vice, namely, a massive superiority complex. 364. There are many strange contradictions. One is fighting for peace. Another is acting high and mighty while promoting equality. 365. Is the aphorism a line of thought without the courage to become an argument? Yes, to the extent that getting into battles and taking risks is courageous. No, to the extent that, by being a lone voice and not drawing support from a like-minded community, it is courage simply of a different order. 366. An argument is always prone to overstating the case it is making, that is, to exaggerating, because it can often do so without being called out. 367. Stereotypes are often offensive and meant to do harm, but, by the same token, treating them as outrageous falsehoods is, in the name of combating them, the will to untruthfulness forged by the will to win, or to win over them, at all costs. 368. The world is full of both beauty and horror, and sometimes it's not so easy to say where one ends and the other begins. 369. Make no mistake. Since earliest times, the vastly greater part of human activity has been cooperation. It's just that the opposite belongs to the category of relatively short-term events and developments that have left the deepest impress on our collective psyche. 370. Yes, the binary way of thinking, the yes or no or true or false way of construing or constituting reality, is dominant in science. But will anyone claim that discussing current events or the politics of the day is scientific? Why then is there this collective will to treat public matters, even those of a controversial nature, as if their structure and movement were as accessible to the mind as chemical or physical events? What generates this rush to find solid ground that, in the flux of things, can only prove illusory? What if not the heat of the moment, the lack of concern for long-term findings, the unscientific approach to this flux, and the multitude of desires and interests that comprise it? 371. And are you surprised that many historical events are shrouded in mystery? Why, think of the events today. Are they so clear? 372. Every argument, no matter what it is, always leaves out something. That's why there's always room for a counter-argument ad infinitum. 373. If one hungers for clarity on an issue, and most people do, then one has no choice, one must be a partisan. 374. Why are absolute truths such a hot commodity? Because all who believe in them can claim, implicitly or otherwise, that others should believe in them and, if they don't, they must be either ignorant or ill-willed. 375. Certain high-profile intellectuals of today play the same role as the high priests of yesterday. 376. Coming off the weakness of childhood and the still weakness of adolescence is the strength of young adulthood that, as if to make up for its humble origins, is certainly not shy about showing itself off. 377. Think of it. It's virtually impossible to go around in public, at least on a regular basis, completely nude. However, this is not primarily because of strict laws but rather because of a powerful taboo whose import seems to be that, if one breaks it, one is taking the most radical step any human being can take, that is, rejecting one's identity as a human being and returning to one's identity as an animal. 378. The world is like an ocean floor full of the most amazing diversity. However, the optics of the moment can mislead us into thinking that certain exotic plants and animals are far more populous than they actually are. 379. The notion of good versus evil is a royal falsehood because, while being absolutely necessary in human commerce and communication, almost everyone has to buy into it, it's a gross misrepresentation of these very same things. In short, all is much more confused and complicated but dynamically related, every person, every group, every organization being a receptor of both the most noble and ignoble impulses. 380. There are people who can do bad things without suffering from a bad conscience and there are people who cannot. However, it's not assured that the second group is better or better off than the first four. If they don't come to grips with their situation, they can be every bit as dangerous. 381. The most common way to be not wholly truthful, even downright untruthful, is to be highly selective in what one speaks truthfully, aka the art of the newspaper. 382. Morality in political combat is a weapon resorted to and used without scruple. 383. Every night the mind goes on holiday for several hours and the body tastes death on the other side of all worry and pain. 384. It's quite amazing that the mind can take in the whole of everything almost without remainder and yet be so far from knowing the details of things in countless different areas. 385. So much in philosophy is an idealization of the human condition with the emphasis on the good. So much in the daily news, however, gives the impression of constant wrongdoing and systemic injustices. Indeed, the distance between these two is so great that it appears both are extreme or at fault and that between them is the happy hunting ground where they coexist and, perhaps to some extent, feed off each other. 386. Of all the sayings handed down to us from the past, perhaps none have been more honored by men's words and less honored by men's deeds than the following: judge not lest ye be judged, and, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. 387. Shakespeare said, but to the waste do the gods inherit, beneath is all the fiends. B. That's the way I feel, even on my best days. 388. It's ridiculous to think there will be universal peace or justice as long as there are people who can look upon others as their enemy. For even if they do so in the name of good, there will always be the temptation to do bad by arguing that the end justifies the means. 389. How many of us are guilty of gorging on the latest news and then, for some reason or other, complaining that it gives us indigestion? 390. The good-evil dichotomy is the axis upon which action is taken drastically and irrevocably. 391. Whoever feels morally superior to others, and perhaps that means all of us, let him imagine all he would do or wouldn't do if he feared no repercussions. 392. Without the element of fear, there would be no morality. However, the whole game demands pretending the contrary. 393. Staying alive each and every day depends on a lot of brains besides our own. 394. The pain that comes from making a stupid mistake, especially in front of others, is like that coming from a hard blow to the body. 395. Making a stupid mistake is often like walking onto swampy ground and getting caught before one knows it. 396. Thinking about one's stupidity is like a gnawing cancer until one ends up forgiving oneself for it or forgetting that it ever happened. 397. When perfect justice is done, all facts are taken into consideration. The courtroom best approximates this ideal. For the most part, what occurs outside the courtroom, in the news, public discussion, films, and even in many books and documentaries, falls short of this. 398. A. Yesterday he was right beside me. Today he's in his grave. B. This distance between the right beside me and the in his grave, we live with the thought of its being so great and we're constantly reminded of its being so little. A. You're always speaking about death. Why should young ears or even not so young ears care about this? B. I speak about death for myself and to myself. A. And B. Let those with young or old ears listen in on the conversation if they wish. 399. Trying to persuade and trying to be objective amount to a conflict of interests that can only be minimized. 400. The power of persuasion goes hand in hand with perpetuating the belief that one is being completely informed about a matter.